In the same war on the same side, one man says this is not about regime change. Another says the Iranian people should come into the streets. One man says this is not even really a war. Another says we are going to finish it. That is where this story begins. Not with a missile launch, not with a battlefield map, not with some grand ideological argument, with the simplest sign that a serious country is already in trouble. It cannot describe in one clear sentence what victory actually is. That is the real crisis here, because the real story is not whether the United States can bomb Iran. Of course it can. The real story is that Washington still cannot explain what political condition would allow it to say in any meaningful way that the war has been won, and once a war loses that answer, everything else starts to go rotten. That is why one line from the source matters more than almost everything else. The United States cannot win this war in any meaningful way. Iran only has to survive. If that line is true, then the whole conflict looks different. Then every American airstrike still leaves the same question standing. Then every boast from the White House starts sounding like noise covering a vacuum. Then every day the war continues, the stronger side keeps spending, and the weaker side keeps getting closer to the only outcome it really needs, survival. That is why this war is so dangerous. It is not because America is weak. It is because America is strong without a believable destination. And strength without a believable destination is how great powers walk into traps. You can hear the trap in the language. One day the war is about enrichment. The next day it is about missiles. Then it becomes about defending Israel. Then it becomes about long-term regional order. Then the president talks like regime change is obviously on the table. Then someone else rushes out to say regime change is not the goal. That is not strategic flexibility. That is strategic drift. A real war plan has an end state, not a slogan, not a justification of the day. An end state, you have to be able to point to a concrete political reality and say, if we get there, the war achieved its purpose. Washington still cannot do that. And that failure is not a side issue. It is the whole issue. Because once you start stripping away the slogans, the war keeps collapsing back onto the same hidden center. Regime change, that is the secret buried under almost every public argument. Why eliminate the missiles? Because you do not want Iran to have missiles. But if the regime survives, it rebuilds the missiles. Why destroy enrichment? Because you do not want Iran to enrich. But if the regime survives, it rebuilds enrichment. Why sever Iran from Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis? Because you do not want Iran to support those networks. But if the regime survives, it rebuilds the relationships. This is the problem. Almost nobody in Washington wants to say cleanly, none of the stated goals make permanent sense unless the regime itself changes. That is why regime change is not one option among many. It is the hidden requirement underneath the whole war. And once you admit that, the entire structure starts collapsing under its own weight. Because then you have to answer two questions nobody has answered in any serious way. Can you actually get regime change? And if you get it, what exactly replaces it? Let us take the first question. Can the United States and Israel break the Iranian regime from the air without boots on the ground in a way that produces durable political collapse? I do not see a plausible story. Iran is damaged. Iran is under pressure. Iran is taking real punishment. But punishment is not the same thing as political disappearance. In fact, regimes under existential pressure usually harden before they break. They centralize, they radicalize. They turn survival into ideology. They use destruction as proof that compromise was always impossible. That is the first thing Washington does not want to face. The second is even worse. Suppose, for the sake of argument, that somehow the regime does crack, then who governs Iran, who restores order, who controls the military instruments left behind, who keeps the country from collapsing into a far bloodier struggle, who exactly is the pro-American alternative, rooted inside Iranian society, ready to take power and deliver the strategic outcome Washington wants. There is no serious answer. And that is why every time the conversation drifts toward the Shah as son, the entire operation starts sounding less like strategy and more like fantasy. A man who has spent 45 years in the United States is not a political architecture. He is a confession. He is proof that there is no real post-war design, because once you have to imagine flying in a man from exile and calling that a political solution, you are admitting that the actual replacement state has not been built, not been prepared, and probably does not exist. That is why this war has always felt less designed than improvised, and improvisation is deadly once the bombs have already started falling. Now, put that beside the military reality. There is too much lazy talk about Iran being finished. It is not. It is degraded. That matters. It is damaged. That matters too. But degraded is not the same thing as gone, and damaged is not the same thing as harmless. Iran does not need full capability to keep this war strategically dangerous. It needs enough surviving capability to keep the stronger side from ever closing the war on its own preferred terms. That is a much lower threshold. And by the source S logic, Iran still has it. Enough missiles, enough drones, enough launch capacity. enough will, enough geography, enough proxies, and enough regional pressure points, enough to keep making America spend, enough to keep threatening us bases, Israeli cities, Gulf infrastructure, shipping routes, and the economic arteries that everybody says they want to protect. That is the heart of the problem. Washington still talks as if the main question is how much damage it can do. The real question is whether damage alone can generate political success before the war becomes too expensive, too open-ended, and too incoherent to sustain. That is where the inventory issue becomes much bigger than a budget issue. The United States does not have unlimited weapons. That is not a slogan. That is an industrial fact. We already knew this from Ukraine. We already knew that the American military machine is powerful, but not bottomless. That stockpiles can shrink, that production can lag, and that long wars expose industrial weakness in ways short wars hide. Now stack the Middle East on top of Ukraine while the strategic class keeps talking about China in East Asia as the real pacing challenge. That is not strategic freedom. That is strategic compression. And a compressed power is much easier to bleed than it likes to admit. That is why the source S deepest line remains the most important one. Iran only has to survive. Think about what that means. Iran does not need a grand battlefield victory. It does not need to drive American forces into the sea. It does not need to topple Washington's alliance system. It does not need to look strong in some cinematic way. It only has to avoid political extinction while America keeps spending ammunition, time, attention, credibility, and strategic bandwidth on a war whose victory condition still has not been defined. That is enough. Survival keeps the regime in the game. Survival turns every American tactical success into a temporary result instead of a final one. Survival keeps open the road to rebuilding missiles, rebuilding enrichment, rebuilding regional pressure, and perhaps most dangerously of all, rebuilding with a much stronger incentive to pursue a nuclear deterrent. That is another dark truth people do not want to say aloud. A war sold, partly as a way to remove future danger, maybe teaching the surviving Iranian state the strongest possible lesson that survival without a bomb is too dangerous. That is not speculation born from imagination. That is how states learn under trauma. And if that lesson lands, then this war may be manufacturing a larger future problem, even if it wins every current headline. Now add the escalation ladder. This is where every confident story from Washington begins to decay. If Tehran concludes that the war is not about bargaining, but about ending the regime, then it stops calculating like a state trying to preserve options and starts calculating like a state deciding how much damage it can still inflict before the end. That means Gulf energy, that means ports, that means desalination, that means shipping, that means regional infrastructure, that means the Strait of Hormuz turning from a bargaining lever into a wound. This is the goddamn wrong problem. A state that believes it is facing destruction may decide to make destruction general. And that is why every breezy statement from Washington about finishing the war or limiting the war or controlling the war sounds less like confidence and more like denial. The administration is talking as if the escalation ladder is a staircase it owns. It is not. It is a staircase both sides are on, and one side only has to decide that the building is already on fire. That is the danger. So how does this end? Maybe there is still a way down. Maybe both sides decide the price is too high. Maybe Trump tries at some point to walk away the way he walked away from the Houthis after discovering that bravado did not generate victory. But even that off-ramp is much harder. Now, because the rhetoric is bigger, because the public promises are bigger, because the tie to Israel is tighter, because every step up the ladder creates its own audience cost against stepping down. That is why I think the United States is not just in a hard war. It is in a trap. A war whose meaningful victory condition does not exist. A war whose hidden center is regime change. A war whose regime change logic is implausible. A war whose imagined successor state is unserious. A war whose enemy still retains enough capability to keep imposing cost. A war whose continuation keeps deepening the very contradictions that made the war incoherent in the first place. That is not strategy. That is momentum with explosives. And momentum with explosives is how powerful states get themselves into situations they later call tragic, confusing, or unavoidable. It is none of those things. It is the consequence of entering a war before answering the one question that mattered most. What does victory look like? Washington still cannot answer. Iran does not have to. Iran only has to live. And if you compress the whole story into one hard line, it is this: America can keep dropping bombs. It still cannot drop an ending.